Hi, everyone. I am really pleased to welcome you this afternoon or this morning for you to our last webinar of 2024. What we want to present you today is what we expect to see in Latin American logistics industry in 2025. So we have multiple topics to discuss. Obviously, Trump and the US presidency is one of them. Opportunities, challenges in Latin America, and we wanted to create this new version in which is a shorter webinar. We have probably a more dynamic presentation conversation. So I will ask for you to be very engaged in the chat. So in the chat, I will ask you questions. So please answer with your comments, with your point of view about Latin America, so we can have an actual conversation, even though that I'm the one presenting, because I want also to get your feedback and point of view about what's going to happen in 2025. So moving on to the next slide. Basically, this is the legal notice. I won't spend time reading it, but the goal of this slide is to let you know that we do our best to validate all the information that we are sharing with you today. However, it is expected that you use this information in conjunction with other sources of information if you're making a decision in Latin America. So let's kick it off. Since we have a short amount of time, we can talk about AMI and what we do later on in the presentation, but let's dive into right now, because I want to deliver as much value as possible in these 28 minutes that we have. So we will have these as the one of the guiding principles of the presentation. What's going to happen with Trump, with the US, and their relationship with Latin America. So on this slide, what I want to share with you is how different countries are exposed either with risks or with opportunities, because there will be opportunities. Everyone is very focused in terms of the potential tariffs, the potential risks that the new Trump administration will have in Latin America. And the conclusion for me, after reading and talking with many companies, with many logistics providers, is that Trump may be a blessing in disguise for Latin America, because we will see how Mexico is in the front lines in terms of potential risks, but we will see opportunities for Mexico for sure. We will see opportunities when it comes to filling the void that China will have, and the Chinese US trade war. Now we see that Mexico is becoming a key participant in that trade war, but the reality is that the supply chain uh, connection between the US, Canada, and Mexico is so high that it is very difficult to disrupt, even for an individual like Trump, which is very disruptive. So there are opportunities as well for Argentina, for Brazil, for Colombia, and that's something that I want to show you and I want to share with you this afternoon. So let's move on to the next one, because I want to talk about Trump and the potential tariff scenario, because everyone in the logistics industry, in the everyone shipping to the US is very concerned about this. So what's what's the different scenarios that Bloomberg Economics have predicted for 2025? I really like this slide, because the reality is that Trump tariffs will be targeted and sequenced. Targeted because, let's remember, Trump was elected because of the inflation. Part of the reason was because of the high inflation that Americans went through the Biden administration, and because of that, he's going to be very focused on targeting some categories and some products that do not directly impact inflation in the short term. So when we think about potential tariffs, let's remember that capital goods, intermediate goods might be one of the first targeted, especially when we think about machinery, for instance, exported from Mexico or from Brazil. Those could be targets. So the industrial space could be targeted initially, but those tariffs may be sequenced. So let's remember that in the first Trump presidency, he overpromised, but he underdelivered in many aspects. When we think about the Chinese US trade war, he promised too much and he underdelivered with a deal with China that China never fulfilled. So that's very important to consider. Also, Trump overpromised to build a wall in the US Mexico border and he underdelivered. Now he's talking about deporting more than 12 million illegal immigrants, and that's very challenging. I remember that back in 1999 and 2000, at the peak of deportations in the US, per year, the US government was deporting 1 million immigrants. So if he says that he's planning to remove 11 million illegal immigrants in 4 years, that's very difficult. It is not impossible. However, at the peak, we can expect at least 1 million deportations per year. And that's not going to happen in 2025. Perhaps 2026, we could get to 1 million, but 2025, perhaps we will see 500 to 600,000 deportations. So that's very important to consider because he overpromises, but underdelivers. He's looking for quick wins. That's why he's posing this 25% tariff hike on Mexican goods because he's looking for negotiation with the Mexicans, especially to receive those illegal immigrants as he did during his first presidency. So he loves the headlines, but how much he can deliver is something very different. So that is very important. That's why you see that he has promised 20% or between 10 and 20% tariffs, and that's very unlikely. So the baseline scenario for the rest of the world is actually more limited, around 4 or 5%. So let's keep the big picture in our radars when it comes to the real impact to Latin America and especially to Mexico. So let's move on to the next one. I love this visual and I know that I have participants that are very visual in this webinar. So when you look at the visuals, basically you see how Mexico accounts for exports to the US and the actual changes between Obama, Trump, and Biden across an span of 14 years. Mexico has always been the top exporter to the US, and when we look at Mexico's exports, we are seeing machinery, transport equipment. However, for the rest of Latin America, we have miscellaneous manufactured goods. We have food and live animals. We have other categories, and that's where we see opportunities. Again, the first tariffs may be targeted towards intermediate goods, raw materials, because the idea is not to impact inflation. That's Trump's goal. So in that sense, I like to show you how trade has evolved with a Democratic administration or a Republican administration. So that's very important also to consider when it comes to how that impacts our sectors and how that impacts the logistics space, for instance. So let's move on to the next one. And here, again, very visual, I want to show you the opportunities of growth because when you look at 2018 to 2022 on the left, you see that the majority of growth in Latin America came from Mexico. Now, in 2023 to 2027, the majority of growth in the region, if we look at GDP measured in US dollars, is Brazil. So Brazil has had an spectacular 2024, a great 2023. Growth rates in the GDP levels were above expectation, but now we are facing challenges in Brazil. Currency devaluation has been one of the greatest challenges that the Brazilian administration is facing. Now, the Brazilian real is one of the worst performing currencies in the developing world, and the Lula administration has been focused on slashing government spending because that's a great concern right now. However, the positive tailwinds that the Brazilian economy experiences right now is how it will play out this trade war between the US and China, because Brazil has benefited a lot and has grown its exports to China, replacing some of the US exports as a result of this trade war. So, opportunities in Brazil. In Argentina with the Javier Milei administration, there's a lot of potential, as this quarter data was just released yesterday. This quarter, the Argentine economy came out of the recession. So the administration has been slashing government spending. Inflation is under control right now, and we expect to see the government lifting currency restrictions next year, and that's going to attract a lot of investment into the country, not only on the oil and gas sector, but actually companies investing in the Argentine economy. I read last week that JP Morgan is planning to hire over 1,500 employees for a hub in Argentina next year. So we are seeing opportunities of growth, especially when it comes to imports in the Argentine economy as the currency stabilizes. And now the gap between the legal currency and the illegal exchange rates, it's very short. So that gap is very small, and we will likely see the lifting of those restrictions next year. So Argentina is going to have a lot of opportunities when it comes to exports and imports, especially benefiting logistic service providers. And Mexico, let's not forget Mexico. Mexico has been blessed because of its geography, because of nearshoring, and the relationship between the US president and the Mexican president. It's yet to be seen how they will interact, but I'm very confident in the Mexican diplomats. They're really technocrats. The foreign minister is actually the economy minister. He was the actual leader of the renegotiation of the USMCA back in the first Trump's presidency. So that's very important. They're very technocrats, and they're knowledgeable about how to deal with these type of threats. So those are some of the big takeaways on this slide. Let's move on to the next one. So net increases in import volumes, definitely Mexico and Brazil are there in your top two, Argentina as well. Chile definitely will benefit as well. Chile continues to grow its exports and imports because the economy is recovering. 2024 was a recovery year for the Chilean economy, and next year we expect the economy as well to grow more rapidly than its peers in South America, for instance, Colombia or Peru. So that's very positive. If some of the participants in this webinar are actually providing services or selling to Chilean companies, we expect to see next year a positive tailwind for Chile as well. Let's move on to the next one, because here I want to pose a question to everyone. These are the official numbers. Latin America is expected to grow 2.3% next year. But what is your expectation? What is your feedback in terms of your daily operations? How Latin America will perform next year versus 2024? Will it be better, equal, worse? What do you expect? Just type it in the chat and tell me what do you expect to see in Latin America, because it is very important to get your thoughts and to hear what are you expecting next year. Is it gonna be all gloom and doom with Trump, or we're gonna find opportunities as I'm discussing? What's your feeling? I like to see some of the chat comments. Please feel free to jump in. Or if you have questions, please use the tab on the Q&A so we can actually have a Q&A section at the end of these 30 minutes. So let's move on to the next one. So while you guys type in your comments about Latin America in 2025 and what you expect to see in your industries, I like to talk to you a little bit about AMI. So please continue to write in your comments. So what do we do? We help companies to make strategic decisions. That's the core of what we do. We create tailor-made reports for clients in which we demystify the region and we provide the insights and the data that you guys need to make a decision. So we help you understand your customers, your competitors, understand the context as I'm talking about Trump and politics, economics, what might impact your sectors, your industries. We help you understand better Latin America and your specific segments, your specific markets of interest. So that's something that I cannot do in 30 minutes, and that's why if we move on to the next slide, I like to invite you. These are some of the clients that we have worked in the past. As you see, very large multinationals and global leaders in the different industries. But I want to invite you to book meetings with me. This is a QR code. Just send me an email if you have a follow-up question, if you have a comment. I like to engage with you, just helping you understand Latin America, helping you find information that you don't have right now. The idea of this webinar is just exchanging ideas. I know that we have really smart and bright individuals today. So my goal is just to connect with you, share some of the findings that I have learned by talking with customers, with logistics service providers, and I'm here to add value to you guys. So I will be very happy to continue this conversation and share more details with you offline and book meetings if you are willing or need information in Latin America. So let's move on. I've seen some of the comments. Okay, so I have disruption in the footwear sector. I expect lower growth in 2025 due to politics changes, expecting growth in Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, as I discussed. Footwear brands that are affiliated are looking to move manufacturing out of China to other countries, and this process will take time and planning. So I really like those comments because when we look at the politics, Trump is a very disruptive figure, and we have seen how Latin America may, during the pandemic and in the past 4 years, the Latin American countries, many of them switched to the left just because of a rejection of the situation, of the status quo. However, now we start to see a shift towards the right. Now we will start to see countries in Brazil, for instance, in its election in 2026, we might see the right winning again the presidency in Chile as well, Colombia. So I expect politics to actually become a tailwind for the region at the end of next year, beginning of 2026. And I'm really excited, for instance, to see how Trump and Milei work together because they have similar personalities. Milei was one of the first presidents that met with Trump right after his election. So that relationship will provide some examples in terms of how Trump will behave with similar minds in Latin America or with presidents that are leaning towards the right. So that's very interesting to see. It's very difficult for Chinese companies to or for manufacturers to move production out of China, and Chinese companies are actually looking towards the developing world to set up manufacturing plants to expand their footprint because they're looking to Trump proof their operations in the next 4 years. So they're looking to expand to new markets, and the relationship between China and Latin America has evolved dramatically. So now we're seeing more Chinese brands in Latin America. Not only the traditional brands that we used to see 20 years ago, but now we're seeing Chinese automotive companies leading in South America, BYD, etc. We are seeing Huawei, Xiaomi as one of the leading mobile phone companies, and that's very important because that's the opportunity that we see. So when we look at the potential impacts specifically on the logistics space, the first one that I want to highlight is cross-border e-commerce, because cross-border e-commerce stands to gain a lot, especially from the changes and the tariffs that Trump imposes on China. In a recent study I just read yesterday, 50% of the deliveries in the US that are purchases from China or from Shein, Temu, they're going to the poorest zip codes in the US. That means that US consumers are buying in China because of price. That's not a discover. However, Latin American companies, especially in the textile sector, active wear sector, those companies, especially SMEs, medium size, even large corporations, they have an opportunity to use and to fill the void that Chinese companies will leave in the US. And that's because Latin Americans produce really good footwear, for instance, textiles. They produce really good clothing, and they have really competitive prices. They cannot compete with the Chinese because they have the best prices. However, when the US starts putting tariffs on Chinese goods, especially closing the loophole, the minimis loophole that exists today in the US, there that will open opportunity. That's why we're seeing a compound annual growth rate of cross-border e-commerce in Latin America, especially outbound, of 47%. So that's an opportunity, and that's what I refer to the Trump blessing in disguise. So let's move on to the next one. I really like this slide because it shows you in a very concrete way the Chinese influence in Mexico. And that's where we expect to see a heavy target of the US Trump administration, because the bottom chart shows you the yellow part of the graph actually shows you the Mexican official data when it comes to Chinese FDI in Mexico. However, the orange, which is the largest section, shows you the actual value amount of the deals announced by Chinese companies. And the official data reports close to $500 million in FDI, but the reality is that the value of the deals announced is over $4 billion. So that's why the US is very concerned with this. And Chinese exports have almost doubled in the past 6 years or 7 years. So that's where the US is going to focus. The US is not going to focus in the automotive industry. The US is not going to focus on on those industries that are very intertwined and that depend heavily on regional content. They will focus on those sectors that import a lot of components from China, because he's focused on replacing that with actual US and regional companies. And this is key for you guys to understand. Uh, let's move on to the next one. So the Argentine economy, I have spoken a lot about this. There are opportunities, especially on the consumer electronics, computers, aircraft parts. So when you look at the shift, basically 2024 was a recession year for the Argentine economy. And now 2025, we will see a boost, and 2026, we will see a boost in imports. All imports to Argentina will rebound dramatically, and that's going to create opportunities for logistics service providers and for shippers as well. So very important to have that in consideration, especially as the government lifts currency restrictions. Let's move on to the next one. Brazil, we may see growth in Brazil, but also we are seeing potential headwinds. So despite imports continue to grow, let's remember that after the European Union, the US is the second market that receives manufactured goods from Brazil or industrial goods. So Trump and Lula have a very conflicting relationship, and we may see some of the spillover effects of that trade war playing into the Brazilian exports to the US. So even though that Brazil will benefit exporting more goods to China, and also we expect to see the ratification of the Mercosur EU trade deal, the free trade agreement. We expect that to occur by the end of next year. So that will provide, again, a positive tailwind. However, the headwind is the US and the manufacturing exports from Brazil. That's something important to consider. Again, inflation is rising in Brazil. So 2024 has been a year of growth for Brazilians, because when you look at the actual growth of income of the common folks in Brazil, it almost grew 9%. So wages were growing and inflation was under control. However, during the past 6 months, we are seeing inflation rising. We will see the government slashing spending, and that's going to create an impact in terms of domestic consumption in Brazil. So that's going to create, again, another headwind for Brazilian growth in 2025. Let's move on to the next one. Immigration. So we did a really detailed analysis in terms of how deportations and depending on the number of deportations from the US, how will that impact the economies in Central America and Mexico. So on the left, you see the number of estimated illegal alien population in the US. So the majority are Mexicans, Salvadorians, Guatemalans, and Hondurans. Here is not Mexico in the chart, but because the size of illegal immigrants, they account for 4.5 million people in the US, as opposed to El Salvador and Guatemala, which have less than 1 million. So it is very important to consider that for some of these economies, the impact of reduced remittances will be critical, especially in 2026. We may actually see a bump in remittances next year that will drive consumption in Central America, as some of the illegal immigrants just prepare for deportations. They send more money, they plan for their future living in their country. So we might see a bump in remittances. However, the actual economic impact of deportations would be close to $3 billion in remittances lost by 2026. And when you look at $3 billion in the GDPs of Guatemala, El Salvador, they have some impact, especially for Guatemala, in which they account for 18% of the GDP. But the reality is that the impact is not going to be as dramatic as many are discussing on the newspapers and in forums. So this is the actual reality of the deportations and their economic impact in Central America. Let's move on to the next one. So intra-Latin American food trade. This is another opportunity. Very quickly, Latin America exports only 25% of its food products within the region, within Latin America. 75% go globally. And when we compare that with other regions in the world, for instance, in Asia, that is close to 45%. So there are potential opportunities, especially for Latin American countries selling to Caribbean, because the Caribbean relies on Europe, the US, other markets, but they don't buy as much from South American producers, from Central American producers. So there's an opportunity to actually grow the intra-regional sales. Let's move on to the next one. So I know everyone is talking about AI. The reality, what we have seen in the studies that we have done about AI and the impact that it has on the logistics industry. Many companies have focused on optimizing information, optimizing operations through forecasting, doing data analytics. That's where AI helps a lot. We don't see AI actually replacing workers in our industry. It's very difficult to replace workers in port operations, in trucking companies. So the actual impact that AI will have in Latin America is a boost in productivity. That's super important for you guys to know, because productivity is one of the biggest challenges for Latin America. If you compare productivity growth in Latin America versus Asia in a 50-year span, you will see that Latin America's productivity rate grew by 0.06% per year in between 1960 and 2019. In Asia, the productivity levels grew by 2.6% per year. So there's a tremendous gap when it comes to the productivity that Latin American workers have versus other regions of the world. And that's where AI will level the playing field, especially when it comes to optimizing operations and giving workers the right tools to actually produce what they have to produce. That's where we see AI playing a role in Latin American logistics space, not in automation. Automation is probably the key impact on the developed world in Europe, in Asia, in the US, not in Latin America. So I think with this one, we wrap it up, or we have one more. Yeah, we have one more very quickly before we finish the webinar. This is an AMI risk index that we created using different sources. So we know that many clients are looking to understand where is safe to operate, where do I find risks in Latin America, what are the worst countries to operate in, and we combined three different risks in this chart: climate, security, and logistics performance risks. So it's not surprised to see that Uruguay is one of the safest places to operate, as well as Chile. But when you look at Colombia, Mexico, Guatemala, they are at the bottom of this list, especially when we look at climate and security risks. We have seen dramatic flooding in Brazil in June, May. We have seen wildfires impacting Chile, Colombia. We're seeing water shortages in Mexico. So it's very important for companies to understand where are the biggest risks in Latin America and where you will have opportunities to outmaneuver your competitors. So with this, I want to wrap up the presentation. I want to thank you for your participation. I hope that I brought value to you, a different perspective about what's to come in the logistics and in the Latin American economies from what you see and read in the newspaper. So this is something very useful. Again, if you want to book a meeting with me to further discuss any potential project that you have, if you're looking for additional information in your industry, in your sector, feel free to reach out to me. I will be very happy to speak with you. This is for free, so don't worry about it. And I'll hope to get in touch with you soon. I wish you the best for 2025. Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year for all of you. Thank you so much.